This week, our three panelists are joining us from Ottawa. Susan Riley is a freelance columnist. John Ibbitson is with the Globe and Mail. And Rosemary Barton is with CBC News. And Brian Stewart, a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs, is here with me in Toronto. And as Brian, you were just saying to me, and you're right, that just to hear the sounds, when Jeff Semple just let us hear that celebratory feel in the streets of Paris, I don't know whether people would have expected that given what happened just a few days ago. And the crowds, I mean, 1 million people there. Let's just before we talk, let's just listen in just for a few more seconds. And so there you have it. You can see children in that crowd. It really is a remarkable scene. Rosemary, let's just start with you. Stephen Blaney is there, so Canada's presence is there. Just maybe walk through some of the Canadian political response to what's happening in Paris.
You know, I mean, everyone was obviously stunned, the same way the entire world was. You saw Tom Mulcair come out very quickly because he's a dual citizen of France and Canada. We got word from Justin Trudeau as well. But it wasn't until, I guess it was 2 days later, when we finally heard from the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, about his feelings about this. And when we did hear from him, I think people were surprised at the toughness of the language. And we can get into why he might be doing that politically, and there's plenty of reasons, but he was quite forceful, saying that he believed that jihadis had declared war against us, not just Canada, but countries that share the same kind of values as us. Mm-hmm. And then he did something that, you know, may or may not have worked, and he talked a little bit more about the kinds of things that Canada is doing to combat this, whether it be the fight against ISIS or legislation that he says will come in the coming weeks. You know, the fact that he linked, in some way, I guess, this radicalism directly to the fight against ISIS is the part that I think, you know, may or may not have worked, because we don't really know who is responsible here, although signs point to it being Al-Qaeda. So, you know, those will be the questions to come. But he was, I think everyone would agree, very forceful in his language. And perhaps one of the reasons that he was is because he's trying to show how strong he can be in instances like this versus perhaps his opponents, who he would like Canadians to consider as potentially weaker. John Ibbitson, let me ask you, the Prime Minister is not there. We're seeing David Cameron, Angela Merkel, we're seeing obviously President François Hollande, many world leaders there. Do you think that the Prime Minister should have decided to go and lock arms with those other leaders?
No, not necessarily. I mean, he could have gone, and if he had gone, he would have been criticized, of course, for showboating. The other leaders are European leaders. There's proximity there. I don't believe President Obama is there, or the Japanese Prime Minister is there. So the government is represented by a cabinet minister, not by the Prime Minister himself. But I think Rosie has hit on the nub of this, though. Whatever else you might think about this, and there is, you know, a lot to talk about when you talk about the alleged war on Islamic radical Islam. It is also a domestic political issue. It's an election year, and I think Stephen Harper is going to want to try to wedge the issue. He's going to try to present himself as someone who is tough in this war, who is preparing Canada to fight it. There will be new legislation coming in to enhance the surveillance powers of police and security services to combat terrorism. And he will try to portray Justin Trudeau especially as someone who is weak in this war. As Mr. Trudeau will argue that, in fact, we need to look as well at the root causes of it. What is it that is radicalizing young men to take up arms within our own societies? The real debate in Canada is going to be that debate. Is this simply a question of trying to protect ourselves against the attacks of radicalized young men? Or is there a need to look at the systemic issues surrounding those attacks?
Susan, what do you make of what we're seeing in Paris today? These unbelievable pictures, 1 million people marching through the streets of Paris.
Yes, in a way not surprising, and obviously a testament to the enduring spirit, the devotion to liberty and equality upon which the French Republic is founded. In terms of Canada's reaction, and Mr. Harper's specifically, Some people will see his reaction as resolute. It'll definitely resonate with a lot of Canadians who want that kind of tough talk. Others may see it as somewhat quarrelsome and a bit condescending. I mean, I thought his reaction was, he basically stated the obvious, but as if he had sort of discovered this evil in the world. I think he was setting the stage for almost certainly an extension of our commitment in northern Iraq in the war, so-called war against ISIS. I think I would be amazed if Canadians' commitment was not extended. And again, that would be a wedge issue because, as we know, both opposition parties have, to date at least, been opposed to that. As for the new terrorism measures, you sort of wonder what is left to do, really. Mr. Peter MacKay has mused about toughening up the preventive arrest provisions, but there is already quite an impressive body of legislation specifically geared at terrorism attacks. I think 17 people have been charged under these various pieces of legislation since 2001. What more can they do, I think, is the question a lot of people here are asking.
All right, well, we'll get more into that, Susan, but just Brian Stewart is here in studio with me. Just your general impressions about what we're seeing take place in Paris today.
Well, I have to say first, there's a kind of general warm familiarity with a great mobilization like this in France. This is something the French historically have done since 1789. They're fabulous at mobilizing in the streets. It's what they do at moments of celebration and at crisis and sadness. I think this is a remarkable display here. Of France coming together with many emotions, anger, grief, determination, also a sign to the world that we won't be beaten by any of this. We won't be terrorized. We won't be knocked down. It's a wonderful scene of coming together various groups in France, of races, of generations. And it's inspiring, and it will be watched very closely across Europe, because France still has a kind of inspirational leadership role at times in Europe. It will be watched across the world, and it will be watched by the enemies of France too. We'll have to look at this great crowd and say, is this what our attacks really wrought? We didn't end up with a country terrorized and afraid and hiding in their apartments. We ended up by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people to come out in the streets in defense of the very values that the French like to be proud of.
All right. I want to, since we've been alluding to what the Prime Minister and what the Leader of the Opposition had to say, let's listen to Prime Minister Harper first, I believe, and then the Leader of the Opposition, Tom Mulcair, talking about what it is that these attacks in Paris are telling us about the fight against terrorism. Have a listen.
The international jihadist movement has declared war.
It was a coordinated, concerted attack by a group of people intending to intimidate and harm others. So that corresponds to the generally accepted definition of terrorism.
All right. So, John Ibbitson, let me ask you. So the Prime Minister there using that language that this is the jihadis have declared war. Is that, as Susan say, not all that revealing, or is it important language that he's using?
He's escalating something that has already been very heavily escalated. But we've seen this since the attacks last year, especially the attack on Parliament in October, that the Conservatives believe that this is a fundamental conflict between a radicalized religion and Western governments. I don't believe it myself, by the way. I don't think it is, in fact, a war in the conventional sense of the word war, and I don't think it can be fought with the conventional weapons that are used in a war. I think it's much more diffuse than that. But nonetheless, the French are angry and grieving. Canadians not so long ago were angry and grieving. These are powerful political emotions. They stir up an awful lot of excitement and intensity, and they can be used by politicians to further political ends. And I think not just in the case of the Conservatives, but also in the case of the Liberals and the NDP, this this situation is being used to further those ends.
And now, Rosie, let me ask you a little bit about that, because this does put the opposition into an interesting position, right, in terms of how are they going to speak out against some of these new pieces of legislation that some Canadians say is going to decrease the amount of freedom that Canadians have.
Well, you know, what they will do, I think, and where they have some room, is to talk less about how you crack down on terror and the anti-terror measures, which Susan rightly said there are many of them, and to talk about the spaces where the government is not doing as much as they could. We have heard directly from both the head of the RCMP and people within CSIS that they do not believe they have the resources to properly monitor people. Certainly that was an issue in the attack we've seen on Paris. These two gunmen were being monitored, but still were not stopped. It was at least the case in Quebec with Martin Couture-Rouleau, who was being monitored and could not be stopped. So if police don't feel they have the resources, what more will the government do to give them those resources? And then I think the second area where the opposition can push a little bit harder is the issue of how do you prevent it from happening in the first place? And undoubtedly, that is where much of this conversation will go in France as well. If you are feeling marginalized, you are then more likely, more vulnerable to be recruited into some sort of radical movement. What is Canada doing to prevent that from happening in the first place? At this stage, I don't think the government has communicated very well where it intends to go on that front. And so the opposition would be wise, I think, to push some of those ideas forward, because, you know, after the bloody events, you want to know why it happened in the first place. And someone is going to have to, at some point, pick that up and start pushing some of those ideas forward as well.
And Susan, this is an election year, and so this does become a political story as well, inevitably. So what's your take on that?
My take is that there's a real limit as to what the government can do. But one thing they can do is they can provide more resources to the RCMP. And we heard Commissioner Paulson before Christmas saying, look, you know, I can't do everything. We can't follow, even in Canada, where the jihadists or the suspect is number in the hundreds. In France, I believe the list is there's some 2,000 to what Brian will know better than I, but 2,000 to 5,000 people that the police there were unable, as Rosie points out, to check, you know, 24 hours a day, day in, day out. It's really hard to do that, but that's one place the government can make a concrete, you know, kind of an improvement, and they will be pressed to do that, certainly. In terms of how you stop the radicalization at its source, that will require cooperation, active cooperation from the Muslim community, and which is the peaceful Muslim community, the peaceful Muslim majority. And we're seeing more and more of that. They're starting to come forward. I don't know if government can help accelerate or support that effort. If they can, that would probably be useful too.
I want to ask all of you just a more general question, and this came out today. Eric Holder, the United States, announcing that there's going to be a terrorism-focused security summit in late February, so I think it's February 18th. Eric Holder saying concern about lone wolf attacks keeps him up at night. I mean, this kind of language that we're hearing from leaders, you know, yesterday, for instance, I was speaking with Ray Boisvert from former intelligence director at CSIS, and I said, is this the new normal? Are we just going to have attacks just every few weeks at somewhere in the world? And he says, yeah, probably. This is the new normal. We're nowhere near cresting. So, Brian, how do leaders deal with this?
Well, first of all, this is why some security experts don't like the word war, a war on terrorism. War suggests that basically it's going to end sometime in this foreseeable future in a few years. This is not going to end. This is part of basically the new normal that will go on for decades, if not whole generations. So there has to be a major rethink as to how we can do better than just responding to individual attacks. We need all the things that have been said to this moment. All the security services are saying they are desperately short of numbers. To put surveillance on one person for 24/7 requires 30 surveillance agents. Toronto at the moment can apparently follow 2 people at any one time. They're all feeling overwhelmed by numbers right now. But governments have to do more than just rhetoric. Call it a war, say we're going to get tough, bring in a few more laws. It's going to have to throw more resources at it. They're going to have to make sense. And yes, they're going to have to talk and work together very closely on this problem that 5 people were able, in France, in Paris, were able to throw all of Europe into a terrorist tizzy and fear. For a couple people were able to bring Canada to a great moment of grief and sort of, we're dealing with small numbers here. And they don't really know how to break that. They don't know how to get onto that yet, so they need to talk.
And John, what's your sense? You know, that's a good point that Brian is making, that 5 people have done this, and now look, there are 17 people that were dead, and there are 1 million people marching in the streets of Paris. So what does that say?
It says to me that this is going to go on for a very long time and that we're going to get used to it. I'm thinking of Northern Ireland, a situation that went on for decades. And when I was a very young man, I worked as a dress circle attendant at a theatre in London, England, and one of my jobs was to check for bombs after and before each performance. The British got used to the constant, incessant, frightening violence that accompanied that. But they got used to it. They learned to live with it. And eventually, the root causes of the violence in Northern Ireland started to go away. I think that's what we're looking at here. This is going to go on for decades, if not for generations. There will be more of these attacks. We're going to get used to these attacks. It is a resilient society. I don't like it. In fact, I loathe it. But I don't see any way out other than waiting for the root causes ultimately to address themselves, and that will take a very, very long time.
We're already 20 years into attacks. I was covering attacks in Germany, terrorist attacks, 28 years ago. So we've had it already for 28 years. We have no expectation whatsoever to think of a short-term war here. It's something, it's like a cancer in the body, politics. It won't be fatal. We'll be able to live with it. We'll be able to go on. But we will not see its end, and I agree with John. We will learn to live with it.
All right. Thank you all very much. Interesting, serious discussion. Thank you very much to our Sunday Scrum. Susan Riley is a freelance columnist. John Ibbitson is with the Globe and Mail. Rosemary Barton is with CBC News, and Brian Stewart, thank you very much who joined us today.